Well, good afternoon if you are in New York City. Good evening if you are in Milan or Athens. Greetings to people all over the world, including Mexico City. I'm going to add Mexico City tonight. Um, this is Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio. By the way, special love and greetings. I do this every week to people in Ukraine. I'm expanding it. Special love and greetings to people all around the world affected by war. Opera covers war and conflict and strife. And may we all resolve in the coming year that all of us put our efforts toward peace, whatever our differences may be. They are a lot less significant than everything that we have in common as human beings. Opera teaches us that as well. So, welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all around the world. My guest today is Stephen Hastings. And Stephen and I are colleagues in the very sense that we know of each other's work. We've known of each other. I think you and I have only been together in a room once in all of the years that we've done this stuff. We have a lot of overlap in our interest, in our backgrounds, and so on. And so we're going to get into that. But Stephen is my guest today as part of a late autumn 2023 initiative that I'm making on Adagio about Maria Callas as we observe the centennial of her birth in New York on December 2nd, 2023. And Stephen has written a wonderful new book, and that will be part of what we're talking about, but not only. So, Stephen, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Tell me where you are.
I'm in Milan at the moment. Yes, where I've been living basically since the early 1980s, and I've been in Italy since 1978. Okay, so when immediately after university, I came over here.
So I do want to get background for you because I want people to know. I should say, by the way, that the way millions of people who know opera in Italy know Stephen is because for many, many years, he was the Italy correspondent for Opera News, the beloved magazine published by the Metropolitan Opera Guild that this month in November of 2023 has gone out of business. And that's a very sad thing. Maybe, Stephen, we'll talk about Opera News a bit later and your memories of that wonderful publication. But you got to Italy in 1978. Why?
Well, basically because I loved opera, but more immediately because obviously I didn't have enough money just to live here on some private income or something like that. So I had to work, and I didn't really know the language apart from a few words learned on visits as a tourist before that. So I taught English. I have a degree in English language and literature from Oxford. And I did a brief course on how to teach English to foreigners. And I was sent out to a school, actually not in Milan, but in Brianza, in Seregno, which is just to the north of Milan, a sort of industrial area, really. But it was a very exciting, illuminating experience. And practically every weekend, that year, 78 was the year of the bicentenary of La Scala's foundation. And so they were having a longer season than was then usual. And so in September, I remember I saw my first performance there of Trovatore with Fiorenza Cossotto, I remember particularly as Azucena. And so basically from that time on, every weekend I would come to Milan and queue up for a seat in the Loggione.
The Piccionaia, the upper reaches of the theater. Yeah. So, Stephen, there's a coincidence here, and I had no way of knowing this. I lived in Milan in 1978, and I worked at La Scala. I had a Fulbright grant, and I technically lived in Pavia, University of Pavia, south of Milan at the Collegio Ghislietti. And my study was officially contemporary Italian history and culture. The fact was that I was the assistant to Giorgio Strehler, who was the genius, I believe, producer, director, artistic visionary, along with Claudio Abbado in that era at La Scala. And so chances are we were many times breathing the same operatic air because I was there most of the time. And so this is another opening for discussion. But I'm going to only pose one question about that era to you now. When I worked there, people were complaining, even though we had people like Montserrat Caballé and Grace Bumbry and Shirley Verrett and Placido Domingo and Jose Carreras and Renata Scotto a little bit, and Mirella Freni and all the Ruggero Raimondi, Nicolai Ghiaudov, Claudio Abbado, these great conductors, even Gianandrea Gavazzini. Everybody was saying, these old La Scala people, oh, this is a terrible era. There's nothing here. It's not like the time of Callas and Tebaldi and Visconti and Zeffirelli. And, opera's over. And I remember thinking, I don't know. I think these people are pretty good. If you see the Strehler Macbeth with, Capuccilli and Verrett, that was pretty astonishing. And that was not the exception. That was the ruler.
Yes.
Did you at that time realize that you were in what I think was a golden age?
I don't know whether I would have defined it as a golden age with any certainty. However, I had seen already the Strehler, Abbado, Simon Boccanegra when they brought the production over to London. And I was absolutely bowled over by that production. It was by far the greatest Verdi performance I'd ever seen. I hadn't been going to the opera for many years, only since 1971, 72, I started going to Covent Garden. And basically, that sort of level of performance was confirmed when I arrived in 78. And I must say, even now, it seems a terrible thing to say because it's the sort of thing people in their 60s tend to say. But I'm afraid to say that probably those first 3 seasons at La Scala were the best that I remember of all the time I've been regularly following the performances there. I remember the Macbeth was revived. Obviously, it was a slightly earlier production. I think 75 it was first inaugurated, but they did a revival, I think in 79 or anyway around then. I remember a wonderful Faust with, a wonderful Werther with Alfredo Kraus at his very best. I remember the Don Carlo, again, very strongly cast production. I haven't seen a more strongly cast production since then, with Abbado conducting, of course. The production itself perhaps wasn't so wonderful, a Ronconi production. I don't know how much I would like that again today. I do remember one thing, a lot of darkness on stage in some productions. That was fashionable then, and shiny floors at times. Obviously, there were fashions then, just as there are fashions now, and I didn't always agree with them. But I do agree that Strehler was remarkable. And obviously afterwards there were the Nozze di Figaro, Falstaff, and other things in the years that followed.
Führung aus dem Serai,
I saw that much later, actually, that one,
and his last was Così fan tutte that he was working on. I can say that I've been in the presence of many opera stage directors, and I've studied with them or assisted some of them. I will unreservedly say that he was the best one I ever knew. And that does not diminish the work and what I've learned and benefit from all the others who have taught me and inspired me. But he was just something incredibly special. And he made me look at every piece of theater, every piece of music, every word, every text, every line, every gesture, every coordination with a conductor in terms of how the total presentation is made, that it's not just the stage director here and the conductor there, but that they really are collaborators. And I don't always see that collaboration happening in many opera houses with every conductor and stage director. There's no one's fault here, but it was just a beautiful marriage between Abbado. It's what the Italians call un'intesa, an understanding that did not require articulating, but it was just there. And they would work hand in hand. And everybody, myself included, who was in their sphere, we would just learn from these two. And they were politically rather progressive, especially Abbado. And it was kind of like being in an artistic collective, except there was no doubt who number one was, and nobody wanted to dispute that. But we were so admiring of the two number ones and they had such an understanding, even if sometimes they disagreed, that the artistic results usually were rather astonishing. And
yes, I quite agree. And although obviously it's people can decide whether they prefer those who are lucky enough to be present both in the 1950s and 60s and the 1970s can decide which era they prefer. But yes, I agree, and I think what impresses me now, particularly about the Strehler combination, about Strehler's work in general, is that although he was innovative, it was clearly a new approach. At the same time, he was clearly working within the tradition, creatively within a recognizable Italian tradition. What's happened more recently is that so-called innovative productions in Italy have nothing Italian about them at all, and aren't working within that tradition, and aren't even probably aware of what Strehler did, I'm afraid to say, because many Italian directors today seem more inspired by cinema, for example, and not even Italian cinema, but sometimes Italian cinema as well. But anyway, certainly not the Italian theatrical tradition, which has a lot to teach all of us, I think.
So, Stephen, I guess this leads me to a question I didn't plan right away regarding Maria Callas and Renata Tebaldi and Visconti and the era that they were in. Tullio Serafin, the conductor, all the great protagonists of the 1950s and very early 60s in Milan and elsewhere, but especially Milan. You living in Milan continuously and attending opera probably saw some older productions from that era that had a different aesthetic than the Strehler, Ronconi, Pizzi, Zeffirelli, that school that came in the 70s. Zeffirelli was different because he harked back to the 50s.
Yes, well, not to such a great extent as one would expect, because obviously, whereas at the Metropolitan, there was a tradition, also Covent Garden, a tradition of maintaining productions for decades. That's never been the case in Italy, really. And the exceptions were later, yes, they did revive the Zeffirelli dei Nobili, because he only directed and she designed that production. And then the Anna Bolena, which was very significant for me because they revived the Visconti Anna Bolena in 1983. I hope I got it. Or was it 1982 or 3? You'll have to forgive me for not being slightly unsure about that date. And that was a very significant moment for me in my career because that's when I really started working as a music critic in Italy, in Italian, for a radio station. That's how I started. And I remember the first performance I reviewed was Caballet's First Night, and then she didn't sing anymore. She was unwell, and she was replaced by Cecilia Gazdia, and I reviewed her performance as well. There was a very incredible atmosphere in the theatre. Well, first of all, a performance didn't take place because it should have been a replacement for Caballé because she was sick, and Ruth Falcon should have sung in her place. But the audience just didn't let the performance begin, in spite of pleas. I don't know whether you were there yourself or not at that time.
But I read about it.
Yeah, pleas from the conductor, and even Simeonato, as you know, obviously sang in that production with Callas in 1957 and 1958, came on stage begging the audience to remain quiet and let the performance begin. But there was nothing to be done, and basically we all had to file out because the Iron Curtain descended, and so it was clear that no performance was going to take place. But in spite of that,
was the conductor Patanè, or was that?
That's right. Yes, Giuseppe Patanè. Yes, that's right. Yes.
But that was not the night he feigned a heart attack, which was Lucrezia Borgia years later.
Yes. Yes, I was. Yes.
That one I was there for.
Yes. Yes. So
we
that
love
was
opera Italy.
Yes. But that's the sort of thing that doesn't really happen anymore in Italy. I haven't seen that sort of reaction, hostile reaction by an audience since the beginning of this century in Parma. That was the last time it happened.
What about Roberto Alagna in Aida at La Scala? And I like Roberto Alagna as a friend, but he had a rough night. Yeah,
well, it's just a short, just for immediately after Celeste Aida, then he walked off because he was not feeling well. I wasn't there, unfortunately, on that night. That was the opening night of the season. And I think that was a pity, actually, because so I don't want to try and give a first-hand account of that. I did listen to it on the radio, and the voice was sounding a bit rough that during that performance of Celeste Aida. I think it's a great pity because it then I can't remember exactly which year that was. It may have been 2007 or something like that. And he only returned to La Scala in an opera last season, a year ago in Fedora. So we had to wait all that time during his maturity as an artist. And I think that's a great pity. And that may be one of the reasons why in Milan we've never heard him in any of his great French roles, which again I think is a double pity, because if it, I think in that repertoire he's unbeatable. In Romeo, obviously initially Faust and Werther, and other more dramatic roles as well.
And there was a Lucia not too long ago with Diana Damrau and Piotr Bachava, in which Piotr Bachava, wonderful tenor, basically said, well, if the audience is going to behave like this, I don't have to come here. They want me in Dresden and New York and Vienna and Paris and Berlin and everywhere else. I don't have to come here.
Yes. But was that a Lucia or was that a Traviata? I wonder.
Oh, it's Traviata. You're right.
Yeah,
yes. It was a Traviata, yes.
But that was a response to the production, basically.
True.
Yes, Cherniakov's production. And it really, quite honestly, it's difficult to, it just wasn't a success. And in fact, it was promptly replaced with the former production by Liliana Cavalli, which has remained in the repertoire more or less.
Yeah. But this brings up a big point in another way, that audiences everywhere, but especially Milan, to some degree Parma, and a few other places, consider themselves arbiters and active decision makers on the quality of the performance. I would say that the audience in New York is not terribly verbal. They tend to be appreciative. If they don't like a production, they will boo the production, but they won't boo the singers. It's very rare to boo the singers. And I don't believe in booing singers, but I'm saying that the reaction is such that in Milan, I'm not going to name names, but there was an artist who came out on the stage and a great star, and she never had a chance to open her mouth because the audience did not want her, because of the memories of Montserrat Caballé and Maria Callas in the same role. Mm-hmm. And so when this younger artist came out, great singer, they never let her sing. And, it's thrilling to go to La Scala. It's thrilling to work at La Scala. It has an atmosphere like no other theater I've ever worked in. I've worked in most of the big famous ones. But nonetheless, let's telescope back to the 1950s and Maria Callas and the Milan audiences then. You were not there. I was not there. But what do we know about audience behavior and reactions to not only Callas, but all the artists who were appearing in that era?
Well, we know that she, at least, was treated in a very hostile manner, by a sector of the audience that was obviously compensated by other sectors that were very much in favor of her. But she sort of tolerated this. Occasionally, she made a defiant gesture. But I think there are interesting comments by Carlo Maria Giulini, who conducted her in a number of operas during that decade, saying that she always had to battle to win over the audience. Probably the most striking example of that was when she repeated Anna Bolena in 1958 after the situation occurred in Rome, where she didn't feel she could continue with the performance of Norma at the Teatro dell'Opera in Rome. And this was seen as an offense to Italy. And in fact, there was political pressure was put on all Italian opera houses not to engage her. So basically, she just sang the productions she'd already been confirmed for at La Scala that year. And there was a very hostile atmosphere in the audience that night when she went on stage. So she really had to battle with her voice to show that she was still herself, because obviously people had been spreading rumors about her that she'd lost her voice and she was no longer what she was during that performance. And afterwards, someone told me that she didn't feel like a victor at the end. She just felt so sad that she'd had to battle when she'd already given so much to that Milanese audience. She'd had to prove herself one more time, and they hadn't trusted her or thought that perhaps she was justified in walking out, as they called it, from the Rome Opera.
Tell me if you agree or disagree with this statement. In the years, and I imagine you have been featured in a number of European documentaries about different opera stars and singers and figures in opera that appear on the European networks such as Arte, and they're either done in French originally or German originally. When I do them, I speak in either English or Italian. They appear often in Spanish language countries. And I've been on a couple that were describing the rivalry, though I don't think there was much of the rivalry, between Maria Callas and Renata Tebaldi, that supposedly you were one or the other. You couldn't be both. In later years, they tried to recreate that with Shirley Verrett and Grace Bunbury, who were friendly, competitive colleagues, but wonderful artists, both of them. And I loved both Verrett and Bunbury. But I was asked once, I think on the French program I was on, about Callas and Tebaldi, and I said the following, that Callas was born in New York, but had more success and acclaim and love in Europe than the States. Whereas Tebaldi was born in Italy, but had more love and acclaim in New York and the US, but especially New York, because everyone I knew when I was growing up adored Tebaldi. I heard Callas once when I was 9, in March of 1965. She did a Tosca with Franco Corelli and Tito Gobbi, and my father took me. He was a Tebaldi lover, not a Callas lover, but I think he thought that I should see and hear Maria Callas. And frankly, at 9, it was my first Tosca. I didn't have any sense of what I was experiencing. And what I actually took away from that evening was that I liked Tito Gobbi. That was the one who made an impression on me. But nonetheless, I have officially seen Callas, and I do think that her greater part of her career was Europe. She sang in New York, in Chicago, in Dallas, a couple of other places. But I picture her as a European artist who happened to be born in New York and have her beginnings in New York, whereas Tebaldi as someone born in Europe, but who really was an American star, appearing on the Ed Sullivan Show and national television in the 1950s and 60s, and on the cover of Time magazine, and everything about Tebaldi's doings in New York was reported here a lot. Do you feel that that's a fair description or no?
Yes, I think Callas herself would have agreed with that, undoubtedly. She said she always referred to La Scala in later years after she more or less retired. She always said La Scala was her artistic home, and Italy was her artistic home, even though she chose to live in France in the final years of her life, because obviously her entire theatrical repertoire was sung in Italian. She sang some French on disc, but and something live as well in concert, but no complete roles. I think I don't think we should underestimate the importance of the seasons in Chicago, even though they were obviously very short at that time, partly because she was instrumental in reestablishing a company there, in bringing great success to some of the initial performances of that company. And I know that she was very active. I think she was, for example, in Italy, I don't think she ever really actively promoted the production she was in. She didn't give many interviews. She just didn't do much promotional work or of recordings either. Whereas it's very interesting, if you read information from people who were planning the Chicago season and organizing public relations, particularly in the 1954, the first season in the fall of that year, they say that she was very, very cooperative. She got to learn all the journalists' names and gave lots of interviews. Okay. And I think she was very well. In fact, this was very important for her because although Italy was much more important perhaps from an artistic point of view, in terms of record sales, America was the most important country in the world. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I think probably this public relations work she did in 1954 helped a great deal to establish her as a recording artist and win favor for her at that early time. Obviously, the later years, relations with the press became somewhat sour because of the lawsuit in 1955, and then there was that quite partly negative Time cover story in 1956 when she made her Met debut, so she was more cautious then. But I think if we look at the Chicago seasons, they were remarkable because she sang three very different contrasting operas in a short space of time. In 55, Butterfly, Trovatore, and Puritani. It's incredible if you think about it. The three roles, and in 54, Norma, Lucia, and Traviata. So I think it's something to remember. And obviously, the Dallas seasons are, I think, justly famous as well, particularly for her remarkable Medea.
So actually, Stephen, I can speak to some of the Chicago stuff for the following reason. The very first opera company I worked at, even though I'm from New York, was the Lyric Opera Chicago. When I was a teenager, I had mentors there, and long story short, I was there when I was 16 and 17. And so I knew many of the people who were the founders of the company. I only met Carol Fox, but I didn't really know her. But I knew Artis Kranick, and I knew Bruno Bartoletti. I knew various people, Nicola Ricchino. And 50 years later, the company was founded in 1954. First, they did what they called a calling card production of Don Giovanni. But the official opening was November 1st, 1954, with Callas as Norma. And Carol Fox, who was the nominal head of the company, wanted Chicago, the new Lyric Opera Chicago. Chicago had had opera for many years, but financially it never lasted. The new Lyric Opera, which is still the Lyric Opera Chicago, to be La Scala West. And so that they organized the timing of their season to anticipate La Scala, so that the singers who would later go to Milan would come to Chicago, skipping over New York, and only go to Chicago, so that there would be a rivalry. Callas was brought in. She was happy to sing in America, from what I know, because she was, I still say, an American, at least in some ways. And so for that reason, as you said, she was very cooperative with the press. There also is a man there named Danny Newman. And Danny Newman was a genius at promotion, better than anyone in New York or anywhere else, and got Chicagoans to want to love opera, even if they were indifferent to opera. And it became a point of pride that they got Callas. They got certain people before New York. They had more Tito Gobi than New York had. They had more various artists because of this La Scala West concept, which lasted at least into the 1980s, of basically anticipating La Scala and using many of the same singers. 50 years after that, so 2004, because of my long relationship with the company and that I'm a writer, I was asked to write the company history at 50 years. So I spent a lot of time in 2004 in Chicago interviewing Danny Newman, who is still alive, and Artis Kranick, and all the survivors. And the archives that they had there are very fine, and Danny did a good job, and then Magda Krantz and all the people there, so that the Chicago remained very proud of what they had accomplished. And yes, you're completely right that Callas's 2 seasons there were astonishing for what she brought, and in many ways better than what she gave to New York. I shouldn't say that. Better than what New York asked of her, because Mr. Bing of the Metropolitan was rather indifferent and was on the Tebaldi side, so to speak. Callas had a famous encounter with the media, and there's a famous photograph from 1955 of her dressed as Cho-Cho's son, hissing. And you can only say she's hissing. Her teeth are flaring, her lips are flaring, as she's about to be served a summons. And I forget what the summons was about. Do you recall?
Yes, it was a lawyer called Bagarozzi, Eddie Bagarozzi, who Callas, in fact, had known quite well in the year and 10 months or so that she spent in New York between the end of the war, so September 1945, and the spring of 1947. And during that time, she didn't have any engagements as a singer. She was, I think, offered a contract at the Met, but she rejected that offer. There's some controversy about that, but that's my opinion anyway. And she met Bagarozzi, who was always very interested in opera, obviously in a family of Italian origin, and he was married to an Italian, an opera singer of Italian origin herself, Louise Caselotti, who was the daughter of an Italian immigrant who was a singing teacher. And she alternated a singing career, singing Carmen and Azucena and roles like that, as quite a dramatic mezzo, in provincial houses in the United States, with a teaching career, which I think in the end was quite an illustrious teaching career. She was a respected teacher, and she worked for Callas for well over a year. According to Casellotti, Callas went to her every day, basically, throughout that period. In fact, there's evidence that she wasn't quite as assiduous as that, but they did certainly spend a lot of time together. And towards the end of that period, Callas started preparing with her the role of Turandot, because Bagarozzi, who'd already, his brother, I think, had been an impresario, a theatrical impresario, and he too wanted to establish a company in Chicago. And he wanted Callas to sing Turandot and also Aida, two of the operas that were planned. But then there was not sufficient money to pay for these productions, I think, cover the costs of the chorus or whatever. And in fact, a lot of singers who come, especially over from Europe, were without salary and without even the financial means to return to their home countries. But anyway, Bagarozzi also managed to persuade Callas to sign a contract with him as her agent. Just as she was about, she had a successful audition with Giovanni Zenatello, who was then artistic director at the Verona Arena. And just as she was about to leave, he got her to sign this contract. There's no doubt, I think there was some sort of, I don't know whether love affair is the right word, but certainly there was a strong bond of sympathy, let's say, between the two of them. And she perhaps felt sorry for him because of the way things had gone with the Chicago project and everything. And she agreed to go ahead and sign this contract. However, he basically did nothing to help her during her subsequent Italian and international career. But he then came forward in about 10 years later, asking to be paid the 10% percentage or whatever it was for all her engagements. He was asking for a very large sum of money. And initially, Callas was very indignant, and she felt that he had no right to claim any money of her. By the way, the bass, Rossi Lemeni, Nicola Rossi Lemeni, had also signed a contract with Bagarozzi, and he came to an agreement just to avoid having the hassle of an extended law case, and paid him some money. Callas didn't, but in the end, she had to, or at least it was her husband who dealt with this matter, because she had written Bagarozzi quite affectionate, friendly letters asking his advice in the first month she was in Italy in 1947, which showed that there was a bond between them and that she did consider him at least an artistic advisor. She might have said she said something like, they've offered me Norma in Barcelona, do you think I should accept? Things like this, which obviously indicates that at least at that time he was advising her in some way. Mm-hmm. So this is why in the end he was paid some money, not very much, however, I think. And this explains why she was being sought by...
And the legacy is that incredibly famous photo, which many people look at and say, well, this is how she was. She was tempestuous. She was whatever she was. Because we didn't know her, we can't talk about her personality. I don't think it's fair to do that if we don't have direct interaction with people. I can talk to you about Giorgio Strehler and all those Tito Gobi, but I cannot talk to a person about Maria Callas. Your book, which I want everyone to get, will there be an English translation, I hope?
Well, I don't know. I'll explain. Shall I explain briefly why it's in Italian and not in English?
But let me first say the title. It's very important. Maria Callas, La formazione dell'artista. I'll say the numbers in English, 1923 to 1947. In other words, Maria Callas, the formation of the artist from 1923, the year of her birth, to 1947, when she was 24. This is a wonderful topic that's less explored. People tend to explore the career, but not the roots and what made her. Why did you go in that direction?
Well, for that very reason, basically, it is a relatively unexplored territory, even though before I started writing it, a book had come out, first of all in Greece, and then also in English translation. There's a translation published by Amadeus Press in America. It's still more or less available if you seek it out. The Unknown Callas by Nicholas Petsalis Diomedes. I think a very significant book. I think underestimated in the reviews that came out in the early years of this century when it was first translated. But this is, for me, has been a primary source because Petsalis Diomedes, being Greek, is obviously much easier for him to have access to the archives in Athens connected with the performances Callas sang in Athens during the war. And also he was not too late to interview or to get hold of interviews a number of people, quite a large number of people who knew Callas at that time during the war. So from, let's say, from when she arrived in Greece in 1937 through to 1945. And there's an incredible amount of information in this book. And he, being a historian, approaches the work in a very scholarly manner. I think he's a very trustworthy writer from that point of view. And he's also very interested in music. So, I can thoroughly recommend his book. And in a way, that's why I perhaps wouldn't have written a book myself if it had been in English initially, because this book has never been translated. His book has never been translated into Italian, and I felt at least some of the information needed to come out in Italian. And hopefully, my book is very different at the same time. First of all, it's a book written by a music critic who's studied Callas's career and recordings for his whole professional life, and I've tried to insert some lot of the knowledge I've acquired during that time, and also my interest in the history of operatic performance particularly over the 20th century. And also, I think knowing so much from a musical point of view does help you understand Callas's priorities. And whereas often Petsalis Diomedes presents sort of different perspectives on certain key moments in her life, and leaves it to the reader really to decide which vision is correct, I tend to interpret things more and try to find a sort of psychological and musical logic, if you like, in the story of her life up to that the age of about 24, as you said.
So I, as a New Yorker, take great pride in the fact that she was born here. And the hospital where she was born is no longer there, but I can point to where the building was and say, and I believe we should put a plaque there.
Yes.
I should ask someone actually for the 100th that really they should put a plaque in this building or on this site was born Maria Callas, December 2nd, 1923. But to me, the biggest enigma in this very enigmatic artist is the following. It was not her choice. Why, if you're born in New York and live in New York, yes, there was an economic depression. Yes, the city was not easy at that time. And it's not ever easy, but it's wonderful. Why do you pick up when you're 13 or 14 and your parents pick you up, and you move from the relative safety and security of the United States to a Europe where the clouds of fascism was already in Italy, and Nazism was rising in Germany, and the clouds of war were clearly present? Why do you pick up and move from New York to Europe, especially Athens, and make your children endure all of World War II in Greece under Nazi attack and under Italian occupation and all the horrors that are visited by war to everyone? Not taking sides here. Innocent people under war suffer horrors no matter what side their governments are on. But why did the family move to Greece?
Well, of course, because it wasn't the whole family. It was just the mother and the two daughters. And basically this happened because the mother didn't get on with the father. So just they didn't get on at all. So it was basically the end of the marriage, even though they didn't officially separate until many years later. So I think the mother was glad to have an excuse to return to Greece. I don't think she was in fact quite an intelligent, shrewd woman in her own way. I don't think she was sufficiently aware of the political climate in general. Also, in Greece, there wasn't perhaps an ideal democratic government at the time, leading up to the Second World War. But I don't think she would have been sensitive to that sort of issue at all. It does seem illogical, considering it's one thing I didn't do in this book, and I would have liked to do if I had to rewrite it or something like that. Try and make a list of all the very good singing teachers who were around in New York in 1937, in theory. However, I would point out that Callas, when she went to Greece, actually started studying at the National Conservatory later that year in 1937, at a very, very young age of, she was just 13. And I think in New York, any responsible singing teacher would not have accepted her as a pupil at that age. Perhaps at 15, yes, but at 13, I think it's very, very unlikely, unless it was someone just interested in the money and would obviously take on anyone. And also, they didn't really have enough money to pay for a good teacher. Obviously, there was always the possibility that a teacher would have accepted her, seeing her talent, would have accepted giving her lessons free of charge. But I think the Callases in New York were not well connected. They were sort of lower middle class. Whereas in Greece, they were quite well placed socially, and particularly the mother, Lisa, came from quite a sort of upper middle class family of military men, and they'd been relatively wealthy. And she knew that there were musical people in her family. Her father had had a good voice, and one of the brothers and a sister too had good voices, and they sang at home and as amateurs, let's say, in choruses and things like that. So she felt with these connections in Greece, it would be possible to organize something. Probably she didn't think it through very carefully, but it turned out to be, I think, the right decision, because then, not immediately, but as early as September of 1938, Callas encountered Elvira de Hidalgo, who I think really was an ideal teacher for her, both because she had a very strong personality, so that would inspire Callas, and also she'd been a coloratura singer, but at the same time, a good actress who'd worked closely with Scialliati touring the United States, for example, with the Il Barbiere di Siviglia. They did many performances together. They may even have had an affair, for all we know. I think de Hidalgo would have been capable of that.
And so would have Chagapin.
Yeah, so would have Scialliati, of course, yes. That goes without saying. And but anyway, they certainly, there was a lot of reciprocal admiration there. And she learned a lot from him. And so I think in many ways it was an ideal teacher for, she was an ideal teacher for Callas.
Tell us more about Elvira de Hidalgo. Why would someone with that name be in Greece?
Well, yes, that indicates that she prioritized, to a certain extent, her private life over her career, because she, I think her voice was slightly in decline. It's difficult to know exactly, because the only recordings from the 1930s, well, first of all, she started very young, as Callas did herself. So I think we must take this into account when looking at the time when the decline started. But there's no doubt, I think she sang a final performance of Traviata, not her last Traviata, but a performance of Traviata at the San Carlo in Naples in about 1928, and that was her last appearance in an important theatre in Italy. She was married to quite influential, important Frenchman who was involved in politics, and also he was a sort of impresario as well. And she lived for a while with him, but then she, I think, came on a first visit to Greece, just touring with her usual operas. One of the remarkable things, a couple of years ago, a biography in Spanish appeared of Elvira de Hidalgo, which has a full chronology. And basically, we noticed that for every single engagement she had in an opera house, she was always asked to sing Il Barbiere di Siviglia, which was her famous role, and then other roles were added on to that. So in a way, it must have been a bit boring for her singing that role for so long, and perhaps that may have led to a certain burnout, if you like, in her career, you know, focusing so much. Although she did actually sing quite a number of roles overall. But anyway, when she was on her first tour in Greece, she fell in love with someone who was again an impresario of a Greek theater in Athens or Piraeus or somewhere like that, and that's why she spent a lot of time in Greece, gradually settling there over the next 2 or 3 years. So by the mid-30s, she was living stably in Greece, and she found a job at the Athens Conservatory, which was the other conservatory with a longer tradition, and it was more prestigious. And that's where Callas herself moved to officially after a couple of years in Greece, but in fact, after little more than a year, she started working with De Hidalgo.
So Verdi wrote an opera. He wrote many great operas called La Forza del Destino, The Force of Destiny. And Carmen, in the third act, as she's playing cards and reading her cards, says, "Le destin est le maître." In other words, destiny is what rules and governs. Fate seems to have brought Maria Callas to Elvira Hidalgo and vice versa. And imagine the variables had Callas stayed in New York or had Hidalgo never gotten to Greece. Yeah. It is rather astonishing.
Yes,
because many singers, and I think certainly Callas, were very formed by their teachers. And, you know, I know many wonderful singers today, and there are many wonderful singers today who give all credit to their teachers in terms of forming them. And many singers well into their careers still go to teachers, even though they're very established big stars. And therefore, it would have been so different had Callas stayed in New York or had her mother, instead of moving to Greece, moved to Philadelphia. All those things are very different. So we have Callas there during the war. Talk about Callas in Athens during the war. I often think of Anna Magnani in the film Roma Città Aperta, Rome Open City, and those scenes of living and struggling and so forth. And I think of Callas in some way, in the same way in Athens, with bombings and attacks and starvation.
Yes, I think you're right to do so, because Athens was occupied by both the Italians and the Germans, but the Italians were allowed to run the city at least until the Italians exited the war in 1943. So it was a very difficult time, because basically the Axis forces took all the cultural produce and took it back to Italy or Germany, particularly. I think it ended up in other countries. So the Greeks had very little to eat, you know, and even wealthy families had great difficulty in surviving. And obviously, there was just this contact with suffering and death every day, really, and the risk of being shot as well. There's the famous episode where we're told that Callas, obviously, they all spoke English, and there were connections with English-speaking people, and they allowed Callas's mother allowed 2 British soldiers to hide in their apartment when the Germans and Italians were already in Athens, and they stayed there for quite a long time. And then finally they left, trying to escape, obviously, from the occupied area. And practically the day after, because someone had been spying probably, Italian soldiers arrived in the apartment and wanted to inspect the entire apartment, looking for evidence of the presence of these soldiers. And if they found evidence, they may well have been shot. You know, the whole family might well have been shot, because that was the punishment for any form of collaboration with what was then the enemy, the British in that case. And Callas went to the piano and immediately started singing Visidate, and in that extreme sort of situation managed to save the life of the family. And I think there's no doubt that this is true, because it's repeated. Actually, Callas herself did not repeat that story, but it was repeated not only by the mother, but also by the sister. And I think there's no doubt that it's true. And I think,
in other words, Callas singing an Italian opera aria persuaded or moved the Italian soldiers to spare their lives.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yes. And they came back in the days that followed, and that obviously created more difficulties because they brought food and everything and became friendly with the family, which obviously meant that fellow Greeks started accusing that family of collaborating with the enemy. But I think having experiences like that and dealing with very cruel authoritarian figures in command helps you when you come to sing an opera like Tosca, helps you believe in that plot. You know, it's not just fiction. It can be something very real. And I think she could believe it. In fact, significantly, that was the first major role she sang in Athens, both in Greek and Italian, because there were Italian troops, so they wanted to entertain them as well. So, and I think actually the other very important element for those war years is the fact that significantly Greece, which obviously Greece is a very provincial country from the point of view of opera. The operatic tradition there is not a strong one. But the representatives of the two greatest operatic cultures, the Italian and the German operatic culture, occupied Athens during the time when Maria Callas was still studying and beginning her career. So in a way, it was a wonderful opportunity to learn directly and assimilate, not only singing in Italian, and obviously De Hidalgo had an Italian husband. She'd lived in Italy and everything, but also, for example, when she sang Fidelio, Leonora in Fidelio in 1944, she had a German director, a Czech director and a German conductor, both of them with a lot of experience in working on Beethoven's opera. So, I think in a way, even the occupation was an ideal experience for her, even though it was a harrowing experience at the same time.
Well, it's very interesting that Callas would sing Leonora and Fidelio at the age of 21 in Athens, in war-torn Athens, when that's an opera about liberation from fascism or domination or totalitarianism, where she, Leonora, liberates her husband, a political prisoner, from a jail. I'm surprised that was allowed to be presented.
Yes, it seems it's one of those strange things about Nazi occupation. Things like that did happen. It's a bit like the Furtwängler performances of Beethoven symphonies in Germany during the war, which express a sort of moral tension and an ethical tension that one doesn't hear in any other performances of those symphonies. And so clearly, we know from witnesses, people who were present at those concerts, live concerts, that they were aware that these interpretations were a gesture of protest against the situation in which all of them found themselves under the Nazi regime. So, and I think Callas was aware that in a way, this Leonora at the late August, early September 1944, when the Germans would leave Athens within a couple of months, she was aware of that situation. I think probably the way her singing had a political significance that it never had in any of her later performances. It was a unique moment in her career.
Also because she sang Tosca, in which the character stabs the chief of police and murders him, and attempts to escape with her lover, escape the totalitarianism of 1800 Rome, and find a new life. And that too it reminds me, many years ago in a divided Berlin, I was working in West Berlin and got to a performance in East Berlin of Tosca. And in that production in East Berlin, when she jumps off the parapet, she was actually jumping off the Berlin Wall in this, production of Scarpe avanti a Dio, into the Spree River, not into the Tiber. Mm-hmm. And it's remarkable how much opera gets away with saying. As Anna Russell said, you can do anything you want as long as you sing it. And that was a similar thing. It's remarkable because, I had a look at your book. I haven't completed it, but I was awakened to many things about the fact that her political formation, her moral fiber, was formed first in New York, but then in her Greek years during the war.
Yes, I think that's definitely true.
Then she left Greece and, famously went to Italy, to Verona, and had auditions and so on. I'm going to ask what sounds like a crude question, but I think you'll understand why. When did she start gaining weight?
I think around about 1948, something like, well, let's say her weight varied a great deal during her adolescence. I think she may have had some sort of glandular dysfunction during her adolescence, a period around when she was starting to study singing. She was overweight, and that was about 1939, 1940. When she started appearing in roles like Tosca, she was quite a bit slimmer. We can see from the photos. The same was true of the Leonora, not as sylph-like as she became in the mid-1950s, but certainly not overweight, because she didn't have big bones. Her bones were quite small, in fact, and so she was quite tall, certainly taller, much taller than most Greek women at that time, and that enabled her to enter the conservatory, even though she was underage, pretending she was older than she was. But then I think something must have happened. It must have been some sort of physical disorder that caused her to increase weight greatly in the late 1940s, because even the photos of Gioconda, for example, and even the beginning of 1948 don't show her as being a very heavy woman. Whereas by 1950, from 50 through to 52, she had increased in weight considerably, and so that's, yes. And that's it.
Because there are many people, I think, who are uninformed, who are not doctors and not don't understand physiology that much, who say when she lost the weight, she lost her voice and so on. She sang magnificently as a heavy woman, and she sang magnificently for part of the career as a slim woman. But it was, I think, other factors that led to the vocal decline that we can talk about. But as you mentioned, 1950. There's a wonderful passage in your book that it's written in Italian, and you've consented to read it aloud and sort of simultaneously translate it. There are a couple of paragraphs in which you talk about Callas in 1950 that to me crystallized so much about her life that perhaps I passively understood, but you very actively awakened me and alerted me to a fact or two that I think is very important going forward as we study Maria Callas when you talk about Callas in 1950. So if you would, I'm going to have a sip of coffee and you do the reading.
Okay, yes, I'm happy to do so. Perhaps what I'll do, if you suggest I read it in Italian, I'll read it in Italian, sentence by sentence, and then I'll explain the meaning of each sentence as I read it. I think it's probably the best thing, rather than attempting a literal translation of each sentence. Okay, we'll begin. La vita di Maria Callas non fu né lunga né tranquilla, ma raggiunse una simmetria perfetta nell'ambito del Novecento. Nel 1950, infatti, il soprano, allora 27enne, si trovava a metà del suo tragitto sulla terra e all'apice delle sue possibilità vocali. Okay, so here I'm pointing out the fact, which is curious, and I don't think it's been noticed by other writers, that there's a strange symmetry to Callas's career, as Callas's life, indeed, within the 20th century. In 1950, which was actually the moment when vocally she was her absolute peak, she was exactly halfway through her life. Okay, so it was a real turning point in her life, and she was 27 years before that and 27 years after that. So a strange symmetry, which I think reflects the fact that she was a symbolic figure within the 19th century. She became one, obviously, she wasn't at that time.
And I'm going to interject something, Stephen, if I may, that every Italian person or every person who lives in Italy and reads Italian and studies Italian has the term mezzo cammin della vita in their head.
Yeah, sure.
This means the halfway point in your life. Most of us don't know when we've reached the halfway point. I think I'm past mine. But Dante wrote about the age of 35 being mezzo cammin della vita on the assumption that life would be 70 years. So you're pointing out that Maria Callas at the age of 27 was at the mezzo cammin, at the halfway point in her life.
Yes.
She could not have known that.
No, of course not. And obviously I had Dante in mind, but I didn't want to, because it's very widely cited, that phrase from Dante. So I avoided that. But obviously Most Italian readers would pick that up. The other thing I think is interesting, although I don't mention that here, is I mention it later in the book, is that 1950 was the year when she spoke and was physically present together with her mother for the last time in her life. So for the second half of her life, she never was physically present in the same room with her. They did correspond, I think, for another year or so until about 1951. And from that point on, there was only indirect correspondence through other people. So again, also from a
and why
personal
was
point
that?
of view. Well, it's a very interesting question. And this is something, in a way, I'm glad, although the conflicts between Callas and her mother emerge very clearly in this book, but also the great debt she had because it was her mother who pushed her into the career. And although Callas always resented that, and I think she did, there's at least one interview in the 1950s where she points out that many young musicians who start out as child prodigies then don't have an adult career, and often they have nervous breakdowns. And this, of course, is exactly true. And if you like, what happened to Callas, the sort of breakdown of her voice, if you like, could be seen as, if you like, a delayed result of that starting so early and being pushed so much, because it was partly, I think, she just didn't have the want to face audiences again and again and have to prove herself again and again for another decade or whatever. But anyway, I'll continue reading, otherwise we'll become too distracted by other things. Come donna, la Callas era tipicamente novecentesca nei suoi dilemmi esistenziali. Come interprete operistica trascendeva il suo tempo. Era capace di ricreare l'aura di un passato lontano e di proiettarsi simultaneamente nel futuro. Un futuro che, grazie al suo ricchissimo lascito sonoro, è ora il nostro presente. Okay, so I say that as a woman, Callas was typically 20th century in her the problems she had to face, also her identity as a woman, many of the things she had to deal with, like separating from her husband, conflicts with parents, obviously, which would have been much less usual in the 19th century, were typically 20th century. Whereas as an operatic interpreter, she transcended her own age, and she could both recreate an aura of an earlier era. And I think there's no doubt she often spoke of the capacity of creating an atmosphere through music, which is undoubtedly an atmosphere belonging to the past, when she sings early 19th century operas, which are themselves often set in an earlier era. So they were written by Donizetti or Bellini or whoever, but describing perhaps the Middle Ages or the Renaissance period or anyway an earlier period. And she was remarkable in her ability to evoke a distant past, and at the same time let it draw us into that past rather than just observing it at a distance as something that doesn't concern us in any way.
I think the prime examples are Norma and Medea.
Yes, I agree. Yes, they're remarkable examples. At the same time, she projected herself into the future, because we are now talking about 100 years after her birth, but about almost 50 years now, only a few years to go, almost 50 years after her death. And this is mainly, I think, thanks, probably we would not be having this conversation if she hadn't, if there were no recordings of her, okay? I think it's very unlikely. And so these recordings are obviously affect our lives in the present. I'll now go on. I'll finish this first paragraph. E sebbene non tutte le sue scelte esecutive risultino in perfetta sintonia con l'effimero gusto odierno, l'essenza della sua arte continua a rivelarsi con immediatezza disarmante, sfidando le capacità di sentire di ogni nuova generazione. Okay, I comment briefly on the fact that we don't today, the musical choices, decisions that Callas made, and made obviously under the influence of the conductors of her time, are not those that necessarily shared today. And I'm thinking, obviously, you can imagine about cuts, for example, in performance. She had very strong opinions about cuts. She was in favor of them. but perhaps I don't know whether it's a good idea to talk about this matter now, but I think it's worth, if we respect her as an artist, I think it's worth at least thinking carefully about what she said about cuts and about her point of view on cuts. But there's no doubt that from that point of view, also she was, although she did quite often embellish the music she sang, she wasn't in favor of insistent embellishment of the sort that became fashionable, for example, in the late 60s, early 1970s. We think particularly, obviously, of Beverly Sills and Marilyn Horne, two other, of course, American singers. Okay, I'll go on. No, the other thing is, I said it's in spite of this fact that, if you like, approach to the scores was not the same as the approach of a singer today, her communicative skill is remarkable and still has an enormous impact. And in a way, I say, sfidando le capacità di sentire di ogni nuova generazione. In other words, it, let's say, challenges our ability to feel deeply, to respond to the deep emotions of the characters and to understand those emotions. Ok, the next paragraph. La vicenda umana della Callas è meno esaltante del lascito artistico, ma la forza espressiva del suo canto è tale che viene spontaneo interrogarci sulle origini di un simile dono comunicativo, sugli influssi derivati dagli ambienti in cui crebbe e sulle scelte dell'adolescente posseduta da ciò che lei stessa definiva una furie d'apprendre. Okay, so basically I said the private life of Callas is not as, if you like, as wonderful and as uplifting as her artistic legacy. But inevitably, the strength of her phrasing, or the strength of that artistic legacy, is such that we inevitably want to find out what lay at the origins of that legacy and how it came about, what influences came from the places she was living in, and how her choices, yes, how were her decisions, yes, influenced by everything that was going on around her. This young woman, who she herself admitted was possessed by this furie d'apprendre, so an immensely strong desire to learn, to assimilate everything she could. Ad Atene, durante la seconda...
Be a sponge, as you say in your book.
Sorry?
Be a sponge.
Yeah, be a sponge, yes, that's in the later chapter, yes. Yeah. Ad Atene, durante la seconda guerra mondiale, Maria Callas accumulò una quantità di esperienze umane, tra inebrianti scoperte espressive e dure prove fisiche e psicologiche, che l'avrebbero segnato in profondità per il resto della vita. Okay, so here it's talking about her private life, just the everyday experiences, very, very difficult, both in a physical sense and a psychological sense. Obviously, living in a country that's occupied by enemy armies is difficult, both physically and psychologically. And at the same time, there was still, even though the husband had remained in America, there was still a lot of tension within the Callas household for various reasons, conflicts between Callas and her mother in particular. And whereas Callas got on very well with her sister in the early years, later on, I think there was a certain amount of rivalry. Her sister quickly acquired a very wealthy boyfriend and was always better dressed. And she was a more classically beautiful woman. And she was several years older than Callas too. So she was an older woman, classically beautiful, and seemed to live a more privileged life than Callas did at that time.
And was that the last of the text?
Yes, that's the end of that section of the book.
Thank you for that. And as I said, I do hope that readers who read Italian will get Maria Callas, La Formazione dell'Artista, 1923-1947, Zecchini Editore from Varese. And can
I show the cover, perhaps?
Of course
show the cover.
Can.
Yeah, I don't know if you could see
September 2023, beautiful cover.
Yeah.
Because it's wonderful, this concept of from these roots. People who've watched my program a lot have heard me frequently cite Aretha Franklin's memoir. That I love the early part of the book. I didn't love the latter part of the book, but the early part of the book, called From These Roots, is where she explains what she awakened to in music, a little bit about her life, her father, especially her religion, but especially what she heard musically and how that got integrated into the musician that Aretha Franklin became. So when I study great singers and artists, I try to understand where they came from, and not the usual fake psychology that one can impose, but really to understand what they said about themselves and what they absorbed that was important. With that in mind, I want to ask you a question that I'm asked all the time about Callas, all the time. That, quote, we can hear her personal pain in her voice. And I was on a program about a year ago about the wonderful jazz singer Billie Holiday. And I was asked the same question about Billie Holiday, whether Billie Holiday, great singer, we heard her misery, her drug addiction, what her trouble with men, whatever we were talking about. She died at the age of 44. And I was asked to compare that to Maria Callas. And so I said, therefore, Ella Fitzgerald, Renata Tebaldi, the security and all that. I think that's much too easy. And I think that, we think about Beethoven late in his career and Mozart late in his career, producing works that are not necessarily about misery and not necessarily about, oh, woe is me. That Beethoven could do the Diabelli variations, which are humorous, and Mozart could write wonderful clarinet music a month before he died that was joyous. I think these are artists who are able to channel what they can channel. Billie Holiday would respond to the lyric and the music, and she was in some ways vocally limited for various ways. She didn't have the supernatural gift of Ella Fitzgerald or even Sarah Vaughan. But Callas, in my view, for most of her career, the choices that we hear were interpretive and not autobiography. I think that she would look at a role and say, this is how Cho-Cho-san or Norma or Madalena and Andrea Chenier would sound, rather than this is how Maria feels today. What do you think?
Yes, I agree. She certainly never spoke in terms of revealing her own personal feelings through the character. Obviously, I think any interpreter has to have a capacity to comprehend certain emotions in order to be able to play the part. So clearly, she had an enormous range of experiences in her early life, and I think there's no doubt this helped. But probably there's a mysterious element that goes beyond that, because we know that great artists who don't necessarily have traumatic experiences are capable of a remarkable emotional penetration, if you like. But yes, you agree. And obviously, there's the whole aspect with Callas, which is so remarkable. I once wrote an article about this, which is the fact that she, particularly from the early 50s onwards, really created a different voice for each role she sang. And this is rarely mentioned because it's something that we don't find in other singers to that extent. There were slight attempts to do that. Obviously, any singer who sings Tosca and then Lucia, there were relatively few of them, of course, would approach the role, and also the timbre would change. But with Callas,
and
it really is
as well.
Yes.
And
With Callas, it's quite radical, and we notice differences even between the lighter roles. And I think it's something she learned. She had it. It was an inborn ability, which I think was connected with her very, very sensitive perception of the colors of the orchestra that was accompanying the voice. So she instinctively, and also the words, the meaning of the words and the color of the words themselves. And I think at the same time, working with a microphone, particularly with someone hypercritical like Walter Legg in the studio, she learned to listen to herself much more critically and discovered a whole range of very delicate colors and nuances that she perhaps wouldn't have discovered on her own in the opera house. And I think so her recorded achievement is very remarkable. Also, the studio recording, they may be, inevitably there is less spontaneity there, and sometimes she's doesn't seem so bold vocally, because obviously in the theatre you derive courage from the presence of the audience. But there's a lot of remarkable achievements, I think, in the recording studio, especially also in roles which she didn't even sing on stage, like Mimi and Carmen, for example, and Manon Lescaut, Ned. I think, and this is something since Warner remasterized the studio recordings about 10 years ago, I think we can understand that remarkable achievement even better than before.
I'm going to do a segment later in the series about Callas just about the recording, so we're going to get into that then with a guest. Do you have favorite Callas recordings? And if so, what is special about them to you?
Yes, one aria I like very much is O Nume Tutelar from Spontini's opera La Vestale, which she sang in the beginning of the 1954-1955 season in a Visconti production. And then she recorded the aria in the summer of 1955, along with the other two arias of Giulia. It's the name of the character. It was sung in Italian translation. It was then usual. Also, Rosa Poncel sang it in the same Italian translation. I think it's remarkable. It's a prayer, and there's also a Poncel recording, and often the two singers have been compared. And there's no doubt that Poncel's is a more luxuriant sound, but I think Callas sings very beautifully. It's a really transparent sound she produces, and as well as I think she conveys more strongly than Poncel the vulnerability of the character. It's interesting because you mentioned, for example, the fierce photo that was taken of her after that butterfly performance when she was threatened, if you like, legally. And we think of her as a dominant, very strong character. But it's a paradox that I think, no opera singer in her repertoire, I don't want to generalize too much, but no opera singer in her repertoire can appear so vulnerable and at the same time so strong in some other, perhaps in the same opera or in a different opera. Obviously, Medea is a very good example from that point of view. That's one recording. Yes, I think that's what immediately comes to mind because it's not such a familiar recording, and I would recommend it strongly to listeners. And perhaps the complete recordings there are, discoveries, things like Turco in Italia. You mentioned obviously the sorrow in the voice, and that's absolutely a brilliant example of comedy. It's a very, very funny or at least witty performance with superb interaction, and it shows how you can convey comedy through purely musical means and verbal means. And she finds exactly the right weight and color for every single syllable in the whole opera, and it's really quite remarkable as a performance.
That it's interesting, Stephen, that would be my favorite undervalued performance on recording by Callas. It leads me to ask you, what do we know, or what do we think we know about her work habits, about her study habits, about how she would build a role? Would she start with the text? Would she start with the music? Did she always work with a teacher? Did she draw from a conductor or a stage director such as Visconti or Zeffirelli?
Okay, I think she could work on her own because she was quite a good pianist. She studied at the conservatory. She took a number of exams in piano, and she could easily accompany herself, so familiarize herself with the score. And she was also, I think, sufficiently good sight reader to read a score and be able to imagine the melody in her head. So she could just look at a score. In fact, one thing she mentions, I think I quoted it perhaps on the back cover of the book, studying silently, but she mentions this also in the years in Greece. She would just sit silently and think about the music and go over it in her head when she was riding on the top of a bus or something like that. And so she emphasized that a lot. She did say that with Seraphine, she would read through for the recitative. She said Seraphine taught her to read the text aloud and then find the right stresses. And in fact, recitative should be sung very freely, and the verbal stresses should sound entirely natural. I don't know to what extent she would read the whole score including the sections that were cut, obviously, that time. But there's no doubt that she would prepare the whole score very thoroughly and would be ready to rehearse without a score from the very first rehearsal. And she would be equally familiar with the parts of the other singers who were present. And she often helped them as well. The best example, I know Di Stefano said that she helped give him the right attack of a phrase in Lucia. And also Gianni Raimondi told me that in Traviata once, when in the Parigi Cara, he had a problem in the pitch, she actually gave him the pitch so that he would attack on the right note. So she was very collaborative from that point of view, at least as far as I've gathered from talking to other singers who knew her well. I think she worked very hard, and she was never tired of rehearsing, basically. Mm-hmm. And this is something right from the beginning we see in this book when preparing Tiefland, an opera by Eugen d'Albert. She wanted as many rehearsals as possible, even in the most difficult conditions, when the lights went out every quarter of an hour or something and had to be lit. The special lamps had to be relit. And I think she was often more demanding than anyone else, and perhaps irritated people in the process. But I think that's
wanted to get it right, go deep.
Yes.
Tiefland means going deep. What was I going to say now? It was regarding that. Oh, stresses. You use the word stresses. And I know what you mean.
Accents, yes, probably.
But I would like you to tell more to the audience about that, because to me, stresses are about choices that are made.
Okay, yes. Obviously, well, first of all, remember that in arias, Italian arias of the 19th century, for example, the singers are basically singing poetry. So the whole series of sort of poetic features, if you like, such as rhyme and whatever, which inevitably emerge and in some way blend with the musical setting. I was talking about recitative. Recitative means accents on particular syllables. And in Italian words, as in English, there's always a one dominant strong syllable in any word. And in fact, in many arias, particularly Verdi, Callas herself pointed this out during her Juilliard school lessons, the accents are incorrect. The stresses are incorrect musically. So you end up singing something which sounds a bit strange, okay? I'll give you an example actually in Puccini that comes to mind. The first phrase of in quelle trine morbide, in the aria of Manon, the stress, the musical stress is on morbide. So so in fact, the Italian singers or Italian-speaking singers tend to blur the musical stress so that it sounds natural from a verbal point of view and also from a musical point of view. But there are many much more evident examples in Verdi, for example. Puccini, on the whole, was better from that point of view. Yes, obviously then there is which words to stress within a sentence, within a musical paragraph. And that's something which requires a natural instinct, I think, particularly in terms of the recitative. And also, obviously, within the musical paragraph of an aria too. And it's, I think it's something Callas would work out for herself, but was never wrong. Another way of
saying this, and I would add, and disagree with me if you wish, that opera singers in general, but especially opera singers, are aided by the fact that musically the composer would tend to put in where the stresses might be, whereas an actor who would be on the stage, I'll take a very famous example, the words are to be or not to be. That is the question. Now, I said them neutrally, but an actor may put stresses such as to be or not to be, or to be or not to be. That is the question. That is the question. Or you can really take it to the extreme and say, to be or not to be, that is the question. And each actor or actress has their own way of putting the stresses. Shakespeare gives us some guidance, other poets, and especially, let's say, Moliere, where there's a cadence to it, would give us guidance, but not to the same degree that we would get from an opera composer, where the stresses are built into the music.
Yes, obviously, even in recitative, of course, there are durations. So I think the rhythm, which is always a 4/4 rhythm, quadruple time, you can interpret that freely. But the relative values of notes need to be more or less respected, although obviously you can be much freer in recitative than during the arias.
And especially in certain forms of opera, such as bel canto, that gives you a lot more room to move
exactly.
as you wish interpretively. You quote Callas in the book, "Cantare per me non è un atto d'orgoglio, ma solo un tentativo di elevazione verso quei cieli dove tutto è l'armonia." In other words, to sing for me is not an act of pride, but just an effort to elevate oneself toward those places in the heavens where everything is harmony.
Yes, yes. I chose to introduce that phrase, which actually comes from a book, a very interesting book, actually, short book by Eugenio Gara, a very good Italian critic, published in 1957, a photographic book, but with an interview with Callas, and that phrase is inserted there by Callas. I think because it reminds us of the idealism in Callas's singing and life, because it's very easy to take a cynical view of her. I notice often people become cynical about her, perhaps because of her choices in her private life or whatever. And I don't think she was a particularly cynical person. I think occasionally, I remember there's a very interesting book, if you want to find out what Callas was like off stage, there's a good book by Robert Sutherland, who accompanied Callas and Di Stefano on their tour, concert tour in the early 1970s. And he is a Scottish pianist, and he kept a diary during this tour, which is quite a long tour. It lasted about a year with breaks in between. And so I think it's a very honest, and he records conversation. I think in this case, it's quite believable conversation rather than the conversations that people remember from 70 years earlier when they're writing their memoirs or something. So it is a credible book. And he, for example, it's interesting that he said that when Callas was Di Stefano, sometimes he heard Callas saying something a little bit cynical with Di Stefano's typical cadence, and it reflected Di Stefano's more cynical point of view. I have great respect for Di Stefano, by the way. I think he was a remarkable singer, and I think although he came in for as much criticism as Callas during that tour, in some ways I think he was the best person to accompany, probably no one else, because if you think of someone like Franco Corelli, who was so, he was too dominated by his own fears to transmit courage to another person. Whereas Di Stefano, I don't know whether you met him, but whenever he shook your hand, he transmitted a great warmth, and I think that's something obviously Callas felt and gave her courage. And so she could perhaps be cynical in response to if she felt someone around her was being cynical, she could just echo that. But I think at least in her music making, there was absolutely nothing cynical about her at all, really.
I would like listeners who are younger than you and I are, and you and I are young, certainly in the context of Maria Callas, but what I mean is that we grew up in a transitional era of media, where we were born when there were LPs, long playing records, and we heard operas, we heard aria albums on LPs. Things moved to compact discs, but they were often recordings that had a different sound. That had a more compressed sound, especially early in the era of compact discs. Now we are in the era where people can pick and choose arias on Adagio, on other formats, and not necessarily listen through. One thing I love about Adagio is that people can listen to whole albums and experience the music as people in the past did. Whereas other formats, you may pick Casta Diva once and then pick La Mama Morta, but there's no connection there necessarily. And you don't necessarily hear the whole opera and can't experience that way. But with the sort of cutting up into bits of music and of musical performance, and the sustainability of listening that you and I grew up having, and we learn from people older than we are. How would Callas, do you think, thrive or not thrive in our contemporary era, in which everything could be out on the internet, in which she was, despite her public life, a private person, and
Yes, yes.
I respect that a lot about her. So was Tebaldi. They were private people who were available as goddesses to audiences who gossiped about them and fought over them and so forth. But they ultimately were devoted to their art and to their work and to conserving their physical estate and to trying to be loved. Tebaldi's love life was not the most thriving, one could say, and Callas's was very fraught. But now everything could be out there for public consumption and digestion and dismissal. I don't know if we could have a Callas now.
Yes, it's difficult to know. I don't think she would have accepted, at least even the working conditions and the manner of presenting opera today. I don't think she would have accepted that. She made a point in the 1970s, when she was interviewed a number of times. She was talking about there's a new direction in production style at that time, and she wasn't in favor of that. And it was now been taken to a much greater extreme, of course. And she gave a good example, which I think is very significant, because I agree 100. I must say personally, I agree 100% with what she said. She gave the example of when she was rehearsing Rossini's Armida with Tullio Serafin in Florence in 1952. When she was singing the great aria, a very, very difficult aria in the second act, which is perhaps the most virtuosic piece she sang in her whole career, she became aware during the rehearsal that someone was dancing behind her. And she stopped immediately and asked Serafin, what's happening back there? And he said, that's something the director wants. And she immediately said, okay, either I sing or that woman dances, not both together. Personally, I think if singers had taken a similar stand on the thousands of occasions that productions presented either a mime or a dancer accompanying an aria, I think they would have done a great service to the operatic art and to our appreciation of it. Because personally, I can't remember a single, although obviously as a critic I've been to many, many performances, I can't remember a single performance during which an aria was accompanied by a dance of some kind, which wasn't a part of the libretto or the dramaturgy, where
So
there was any
Salome
improvement.
would be the exception.
Yes, it was always an irritant and distracted. It's true that not all singers were as magnetic on stage as Callas. So, but I think, how can a singer even learn to develop magnetism if their presence is devalued in this manner? And I think that's a very significant example. In fact, I mentioned that I wrote an article on Callas for the anniversary for the December issue of Opera, the English magazine, which has now incorporated Opera News. And I mentioned that anecdote because it's worth thinking about it, I think.
Well, so we're about to leave Maria to talk about Opera News, but I have one last question. When I name check certain cities at the start of my presentation, I mentioned Mexico City. Yeah. That's sort of an anomaly in the early history of Maria Callas, in that she went to sing Aida in Mexico City. And I don't know any of the details about that, because all anyone talks about is the high E flat in the conclusion of the second act. And, you talk to singers all the way down the line to Aprile Milo and further, who you ask, will she take the high E flat? Will she not? I remember once in performance, Milo did it wonderfully at the Met, but very few do. Verdi didn't write that. Do you know the story of her appearance in Mexico City that drove the crowds wild, and her frankly appearing in North America there and before appearing in the United States?
Well, yes, more or less. I think she went for 3 years, 3 summers basically, to Mexico City, the months around June, July, that period. And she sang a lot of operas there. The first year, I think she sang Aida the first 2 years, so 50 and 51. Norma the first year. Tosca as well. Then the second year, she sang Traviata and Aida. Perhaps I'm forgetting something. And the third year, she sang, was perhaps the most remarkable year. She sang Lucia, Traviata, her only Rigoletto, sort of Gilda, and Tosca again. So a great variety of roles. Yes, I think that was an incredible exploit. She was asked to do it because there was a tradition. I think her name was Angela Peralta, a 19th century singer in Mexico, had inserted that E flat in the Act 2 finale, and they suggested it to Callas. They knew she had an E flat. She initially refused, but then Kurt Baum, who was her Radames in 1950, was apparently behaving very objectionably, and she was irritated by his behavior, and so she decided to insert the note without mentioning it to Baum. So it was a nasty surprise for him. And then she sang it again because it became so popular in 1951 with Delmonico, and Delmonico agreed to let her sing it and said he would sing the same note, obviously the equivalent an octave below, but he sang it in falsetto, so it wasn't audible. His note wasn't audible, and we can hear it on the recording.
People who hear this recording, the explosion of the audience is something phenomenal. And in my era working at the Met, we used to call that kind of applause Nilsonian, as in Birgit Nilsson.
Ah, okay, yes.
And Joan Sutherland, who I adored, didn't get that kind of explosion. She got a different kind of huge ovation.
Yeah.
But this sort of theater building rocking sound, only Hildegard Behrens got that afterwards, and not as often. But I remember when Nielsen sang at the Met when I was a kid and a young adult, that the theater would shake, and the Met is a huge, beautiful building. And I mean, it really shook.
Yeah.
And Krista Ludwig would get that occasionally in Buenos Aires and Barcelona, a couple of other artists in Barcelona. It's the theaters and the audiences, a lot of them are Spanish-speaking audiences, that really respond. So that I remember I heard Caballé Carreras and Andrea Chenier in Barcelona in 1979 or so. There was that kind of Nilsonian sound again. Have you experienced that kind of audience explosion in your opera?
Well, yes, at La Scala, but at other theaters as well. I'm just trying to well, one example I noticed with Alfredo Kraus, for example, which may seem strange because obviously he may seem a cool singer in temperament, and he was to a certain extent, but I think I heard him the first time in the 1970s in Rigoletto, but let's say from about 1984, 1983, for the decade after that, he was a remarkable survivor, first of all, and he was singing unlike practically anyone else. Possibly Nicolai Gedda, to a certain extent, had some of the same qualities, and particularly the potency of his upper register, which can't really be perceived in a recording. Even a live recording doesn't entirely convey it. Possibly a performance recorded from the audience possibly could convey some of the idea, certain idea of that. Was quite remarkable, and in a way it seemed the most potently theatrical voice that was around, tenor voice that was around, but particularly the way the voice expanded as it rose up the scale. So I followed Kraus around quite a lot, and he always got the same response in Vienna too, and Barcelona, and
I happened to be at his very last performance. I didn't know it would be, and I don't know if he knew it would be. It was in Berlin. And he got that kind of explosion. It was Werther with Veselina Kazarova, young Veselina. And I mean, okay, so I seldom declare publicly my favorites. I very seldom do. However, I'll put it this way. When I'm asked who was the best of the three tenors, Pavarotti, Domingo, or Carreras, I always say Alfredo Kraus, which is a diplomatic way of saying it. But I said that both to Domingo and Pavarotti, and they said, you're right. They too understood that there was something about Kraus, not necessarily the most beautiful voice. Bergonzi, Vickers, all these other people had incredible qualities in the same era, Gedda as well. But there was just something about Alfredo Kraus that I would swoon
Yes,
at the sound and the
yes,
singing, the beauty of the singing. And I remember Joan Sutherland. I was involved in a production of Lucia with them, with
oh, yes.
Kraus and Sutherland, and she would come off the stage and she said, "I wish I could do that."
Got
it,
her
it,
accent well.
it was phenomenal. Oh, I could do a lot of Joan
Yeah,
Sutherland accents.
good.
You give me a bit of Australian beer, and boy, can I do that. But Stephen, I came to know your work primarily as a reader and then later writer for Opera News, um, in part because Italy was my subject, and so I turned to writers who wrote about Italy more than I did about other countries. And you were the person I read most in Opera News because you were there almost every month for decades, covering the opera scene in Italy. Occasionally, I would go over and do an article about a festival, a composer on an anniversary, things like that. But
Yeah.
you were the anchor of Opera News in Italy. And Opera News, well, you talk about Opera News as a magazine, founded 1935 by Eleanor Robeson Belmont, and incredibly influential in the opera world. And it has folded in November of 2023.
Yes, well, it's very sad, and it's incredible. 32 years. Writing for it. Probably in a way that was enough, because some part of me says no writer should be in the same place writing about the same things for 32 years, even though obviously everything has changed in those 32 years within the Italian operatic scene. So, and I tried to remember that and recall earlier performances. That's always been important for me, particularly if they were early performances in the same house, for example, not to underline weaknesses in present singers or more recent singers, but just to give an idea of an evolving tradition. I felt very privileged when I discovered that they needed someone in Italy, and I happened to write to them at the right time. I'd been working, in fact, in Italian initially, okay, for Italian magazines and newspapers and radio, and so the articles I wrote for Opera News were the first articles I wrote as a professional music critic in English. So that was in 1991. And it was
Would Robert Jacobson have been your editor?
No, he was already gone. It was
Gone.
Patrick Smith then.
Patrick Smith, okay.
And it was actually
then
a
Brian
review.
Kello, F. Paul
Yeah,
Driscoll. Yeah.
exactly, yes. And it was actually a review from the Rossini Opera Festival of that year. And in fact, my last review for Opera News, which I think probably hasn't come out yet, it's in the November issue, I think, of this year, was this year's Rossini Opera Festival. So it's really closing a cycle there. It's been very stimulating. Obviously, the editors were very different and the approach changed. The magazine changed quite a lot. Obviously, I realized that the changes in the magazine weren't necessarily entirely autonomous decisions by the editors, but there was a whole policy which came down from the general manager of the opera house and was reflected in the magazine. Obviously, we've all noticed the fact of an opera house that was very interested in preserving its own legacy became much more interested in preserving that legacy and reminding people of that legacy in more recent years. And I'm a bit concerned. I don't know whether you've noticed. I've been trying over the last month to connect with the Met Archive online without any success, and it always has that message.
They say it will be back, and I
yeah, they say that, but
yeah.
It occurs to me: is there any connection then? Perhaps the the archive too is threatened, and this makes you reflect, doesn't it? Because apart from the fact that, for example, Opera News was available for subscribers online, also back issues and everything, so one could search the magazine's archive. And one tends to think of these things rather ingenuously as being eternal, but of course they're not eternal. They depend on people who do this work and keep the archive alive and updated and everything. And so I truly hope that the Met Archive will remain, because it's a remarkable achievement. I think it's the best online archive of any opera house in the world. And so
I agree.
And obviously it's one of, if not the most important opera house in the world, one of the 2 or 3 most important opera houses in the world, in many ways the most important, for a whole series of reasons. So, and the fact that all those reviews and everything that they've assembled, to illustrate also the chronology and everything, it's a really remarkable. In fact, it's one of the main instruments, it's a source of main sources of information for another book I'm writing, this time in English, on early 19th century opera arias. And I basically have taken about 36 arias and have chosen what I consider to be the 10 most significant performance of that aria in audio and also video recordings, and describe them in great detail. And this is a project I'm very keen on, and obviously having easy access. I've got obviously the published chronology of the Met, but having easy access to the archive and also reviews is really important for me, as I imagine for many other people.
I'm going to, for listeners who don't know, give a very fast history of the Metropolitan Opera and the Opera Guild. The Met opened October 22nd of 1883 with Gounod's Faust. The second performance was Lucia. They did a lot of performances of Wagner in the early years, especially Lohengrin. The Met gave the first performance of Parsifal outside of Bayreuth in 1903. It had Toscanini and Mahler and all kinds of magnificent conductors in the early part of the 20th century. With the economic boom, and it had the beginning of recordings with Caruso and all the other artists who were here, and say from about 1910 to 1930. Puccini came to New York, wrote operas for the Met, recorded in New York. Radio, beginning in 1924, transmitted music from the Met and other theaters. The first Met broadcast was 1931. The economic depression came, and the Met nearly folded by 1935. And Eleanor Robeson Belmont, who was the wife of a very wealthy man, she was a beautiful actress, retired, created the Metropolitan Opera Guild to raise money to help support the Metropolitan Opera through the economic depression. What she did was she took the gold silk curtain, had it cut into many pieces, and made neckties and handbags and eyeglass cases, and raised money to help save the Met. She also founded the Opera Guild as a fundraising arm, but also as an educational arm to spread opera education. And Opera News magazine was founded as a weekly to come out in the Met season. And it grew when the broadcast became every week in December 7th, 1940, with Le Noce di Figaro. Every week after that, Opera News would connect to Met broadcast. But very quickly, the editors realized if we only cover the Metropolitan Opera, we're the house organ of the Met. And we want to be an independent journalistic entity. And they would cover other opera companies. They would do profiles of singers. They began after World War II to reach out to Europe and have correspondents in London, Milan, Vienna, Paris, and a few other places. And with the arrival of many new artists from Europe in the 1950s, the magazine grew, the broadcast would grow. There would be Opera News on the Air, which were broadcasts about the people from the magazine would often appear and talk about in great detail about a particular role or character or whatever. Or you'd have roundtables with singers, with directors, with conductors. And this flourished into the 60s, and Opera News worked hand in hand with the Met broadcast, but also was an independent journalistic entity that covered the opera world and not just the Metropolitan Opera. I think that there was a certain sensitivity. The late, great editor, Brian Keller, who I know you worked with, tried to maintain that editorial separation from being, in effect, public relations for the Met. There was a lot of controversy. I'm not getting into that now, but the evolution, or I would say the blurring of lines between what is education and what is marketing promotion, got very blurred and very confused. And as people stopped buying print publications and reading online, Opera News itself took a different direction. I believe it continued to play a very valuable role as an entity that brought people to opera, an entity that explained opera to people who didn't know it, an entity that documented what was happening in the opera world, and not just the Met, but throughout. So for me, as a reader and also as someone who wrote many articles. I was not a fixed correspondent, but I would do special reports from places. I would go to Helsinki and write about the Finnish opera scene, that kind of thing. But it's a loss of knowledge. It's like the burning down of a library, when all of this knowledge, even if we will be able ultimately to access it online or in another format, the dialogue between the public and audiences. Another great thing Opera News did was, if a new singer was on the scene and we needed to know about her, we may not know her yet. Opera News might identify her and say, this is someone to watch. And then 5 years later, she would be starring in Paris or somewhere, or Salzburg. And so it is, to me, a great loss. And I wanted to ask you specifically because you, for me, and not just for me, were such a fundamental voice in Opera News magazine that we're going to have to find you elsewhere. Where do we find you, Stephen?
Well, in Opera magazine, the English magazine, which to a certain extent, I don't know exactly. Obviously, there's some sort of agreement. I think Opera, it says Opera with Opera News, this December issue, which will be the first one where they're in some way connected. And I think, what does this mean? I think this means that possibly there'll be a separate printing of Opera magazine in the United States. I don't know whether the content will be in any way different or not, because although I've spoken to the editor, obviously he's so busy with this period of transition that we haven't had a long sort of fireside chat about this. And but I know that there will be greater coverage of already there is coverage of American operas. There will be a greater coverage, and also in the feature articles too, there will be a greater emphasis on America than there is at present. Obviously, it's a British magazine. It was founded in about 1950 by Lord Harwood, and then taken over by Harold Rosenthal. Presently edited by John Allison, and hopefully it will satisfy, to a certain extent at least, the need the needs of opera lovers in the United States as well, and hopefully we'll have a good distribution as well, because I think that was the problem. I don't know whether opera has been available in New York in newsstands and places like that, or
we have so few newsstands left.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so maybe is
there used to be a wonderful shop opposite Lincoln Center that had all the magazines of the world. And I could go in and buy not only opera publications, but anything. If I were interested in automobiles, I could find magazines in German and Italian about automobiles if I wanted, or French fashion magazines, or Spanish magazines about history. It had everything. Arabic, Chinese. It was a wonderful, beautifully maintained shop by an Indian family. And they also sold beautiful Swiss chocolates, and they really took very seriously their cultural role. And again, when that was gone, because New York City, every landlord wants to make more money, and the rent was raised too high, and this family left, and it was a loss. But that's where I would buy British Opera magazine and Das Opernglas in Germany, and all the European opera publications I would buy right there.
Yes. Well, of course, that's the same situation throughout the world now, in Italy too. So I think probably people are compelled to subscribe if they're interested. That seems to be the only solution, or there are, I think, online subscriptions as well if people prefer that,
Yeah. Stephen Hastings, this has been a wonderful visit. You and I never have had the chance to speak at the length we did today, and I'm happy for it. And I hope when you come to New York, I'll see you. When I come to Milan, you will know it.
Yes.
And thank you for this very deep dive into the early life of Maria Callas, especially. Maria Callas, La Formazione dell'Artista, 1923 to 1947. Zecchini is the publisher. It came out in September 2023. And publishers in other languages, I encourage you to translate the book into German and French and Spanish, English, and Arabic and Chinese and Korean and all the other Japanese, all the other languages. And Stephen, buone cose, buon lavoro, as the Italians say.
Okay, grazie Fred. Grazie delle belle parole.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Okay.